Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy reported on February 2, 2026, that over the past 24 hours there have been no new targeted Russian missile or drone strikes specifically aimed at Ukraine's energy infrastructure, marking a momentary reduction in one of the most damaging elements of the Russian military campaign. But he also cautioned that the situation for Ukraine's energy systems and its civilian population remains grave and fragile. Zelenskyy clarified that while energy facilities in some frontline and border communities experienced shelling by Russian forces, these were not deliberate, concentrated missile or Shahed drone attacks on major power plants, transmission networks, or key energy hubs, and the effects of the reduced targeting appear to reflect a temporary operational shift rather than a durable ceasefire, as Russia has, according to the Ukrainian leader, shifted its offensive toward transport and logistics infrastructure, particularly railroad lines and other supply routes that are critical to both civilian life and military movement, underscoring that although this pause in deliberate strikes on energy systems may offer small relief, it does not signal an end to the broader conflict or to attacks on civilian assets. Zelenskyy's comments come in the context of a short-term energy truce, reportedly brokered at the request of U.S. President Donald Trump, intended to halt Russian attacks on energy infrastructure for a limited period to help Ukraine manage an exceptionally harsh winter. But disagreements persist between Kyiv and Moscow over the scope and duration of such agreements, with the Kremlin suggesting a truce until February 1 and Zelenskyy urging that it continue for a week beginning January 30, reflecting ongoing diplomatic tension and the challenge of enforcing any temporary pauses in hostilities. Repair crews in Ukraine have worked under difficult conditions to restore power systems that were previously damaged by extreme cold weather, technical malfunctions, and earlier Russian strikes, and Zelenskyy reported that many of these energy repair tasks have succeeded in stabilizing the grid and restoring critical services, even as winter conditions continue to strain the country's infrastructure and demand for electricity remains high. This operational resilience highlights both the toll that repeated strikes have taken on Ukraine's energy networks and the efforts of Ukrainian workers to keep essential services running for civilians facing freezing temperatures. However, Zelenskyy cautioned that serious challenges remain because of the cumulative impact of past attacks, the severity of the weather, and the ongoing threat of disruptions, and he emphasized that while the system is now operating stably, ongoing vigilance is necessary. Although the absence of new targeted strikes on energy infrastructure over the last day might be seen as a positive development, it is important to understand that shelling of energy facilities continues in areas near the front lines, and that these attacks, even if not part of a concentrated offensive, still contribute to outages, repairs, and hardship for civilians, particularly in regions like Kharkiv, Sumy, Dnipro, and Cherkasy where power has been intermittently cut due to recent damage and where restoration efforts continue amid freezing conditions. The broader strategic picture of the war remains complex. Russian forces, according to Zelenskyy and Ukrainian officials, have increasingly focused on striking logistics infrastructure, such as railway lines, which are vital to Ukraine's supply chains and movement of goods, and these attacks have caused significant damage and civilian casualties, including, as other reports note, recent drone strikes that killed mine workers returning from shifts in the Dnipropetrovsk region and other assaults that struck civilian areas. Although these incidents are not categorized as targeted energy infrastructure strikes, they nevertheless underscore the ongoing risk to civilians and the interconnected nature of Ukraine's infrastructure vulnerabilities. Diplomatic efforts to reduce violence and find a path toward peace continue in parallel, with Ukraine, Russia, and U.S. representatives preparing to meet in Abu Dhabi later in the week to discuss potential resolutions to the conflict, even as the fighting persists and sporadic attacks disrupt lives and critical services. These talks reflect international pressure to find avenues for de-escalation, but the varying interpretations of any temporary agreements, including the energy truce, illustrate the difficulties of turning short-term tactical pauses into durable peace, as both sides maintain differing conditions and timelines. The situation illustrates a nuanced reality where a lack of new targeted strikes on energy infrastructure in the last 24 hours does not equate to peace, nor does it mean that Ukraine's energy sector is out of danger, because the infrastructure is still vulnerable to shelling and indirect damage, and because Russia continues other forms of attacks aimed at undermining Ukraine's logistical capabilities and civilian morale. Zelenskyy's comments emphasize the importance of continued international support, vigilant defense, and swift repair efforts to mitigate the human and economic costs of the war, particularly as winter conditions make energy stability crucial to public health and safety.